Hey everybody, welcome back to the Man Battlestations YouTube channel. I'm Andy, also known as Ruckdog, and today I'm going to address two of the biggest questions I've seen posted online, mainly in the official Sturginium Lounge Dystopian Wars Facebook group, link below, you'll be able to find it there in case you're curious, about the new version of Dystopian Wars. Now, these are some questions I think that are being asked by a lot of older fans of the game. That is to say, fans of the game from previous years under Spartan. And I think it's fair to say that many of us got interested in Dystopian Wars when it first came out back in the late 2010, early 2011 timeframe. And then, for one reason or another, drifted away from the game over the years. But now that we're seeing this brand new edition coming out, I think a lot of us are getting interested in the game again. And so it's only natural that those of us who, unlike me, actually have something of a life and don't pay attention to every little bit of Dystopian Wars news that comes along, might be a little confused about what the new edition of the game is about in a couple of respects. All right, so what are the two biggest questions I've seen about Dystopian Wars 3.0? Number one, where does my old faction fit into the new background? And number two, can I still use my old models with the new rules? So these are the two questions I'm going to be trying to address with this video. So question one, where does my faction fit in? The short answer here is that none of the factions from Dystopian Wars 2.5 and earlier, that is to say the Spartan versions of Dystopian Wars, are going to be carried over into Dystopian Wars 3.0, in exactly the same way. So that means that there's not going to be a direct transplant of the old factions from the old version of the game into the new version of the game. Warcradle has spent a lot of time and effort into coming up with some of their own unique background material for the game, and they've also been incorporating elements from Wild West Exodus, another miniature game that was bought up by Warcradle, and then had their settings merged with Dystopian Wars. Now, there are certain elements that have carried over. So the way I liken this, for those of you that are big Star Wars fans, everybody knows how Disney did away with the officialness of the old expanded universe, the old novels, video games, comics, that sort of thing, that had been put out over the 20 or so years over the 80s and the 90s that greatly expanded the scope of the Star Wars lore. Now, Disney came out and said, yep, all of those books are no longer officially canon. However, as some of you know, Disney's been going back and cherry-picking some of the best elements out of all of that expanded universe stuff and bringing it forward into a new canon. And in some ways, Warcradle is doing a very similar thing. So just like how they've brought Admiral Thrawn back, for example, into the new canon out of the old expanded universe, we're seeing a lot of the same characters and plot points from the original Spartan version of the game being brought forward into the new Warcradle version of the game. Things like Barnabas Sturgeon. Sturgeon and Sturginium are still a thing. Tesla is still kicking around making all kinds of lightning weapons, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this here, but if you go to the official Dystopian Wars webpage, there is lots and lots of background material for you all to chew on there. Specific background for each of the major factions I'm about to discuss, so I highly recommend you go check that out. And again, links in the description below. So like I said, some elements have carried over. The alliances between the different factions, however, have changed. And this is an important point to recognize because it might impact which models you play together on the table. So let's do a little bit of a refresh here. This is directly taken from the 2.5 Dystopian Wars rulebook, and this is the old power structure from the earlier editions of Dystopian Wars. And as you can see, you've got three major blocks here. You've got the Imperial Bond, you've got the Free Nations, and you've got the Grand Coalition. And if you notice something interesting, it sort of kind of roughly breaks down along the Axis and Allies fault lines that you see from World War II. Probably not coincidental. What's interesting here, of course, is that section in the middle. These are what they call the Free Nations, and there's a mixture of mercenary companies, smaller powers, such as the League of Italian States, And a few others in there. They're like the Covenant of Antarctica. That was sort of the universal spoiler. It seems like Covenant of Antarctica, oftentimes in the old fluff, was kind of acting like the Eldar, or the Eldari, I guess as they're called now in the 40K universe, where they're trying to be the puppet masters. They're kind of working the strings from behind the scenes towards some unknown end. The Covenant of Antarctica and the Spartan days had a little bit of that flavor to them. Some of that is still there under the new Covenant of Enlightened, which we'll talk about later in another video. But that was very much what the Covenant was like. And so even though they were a major power, not a mercenary company, not a minor power like the other free nations were, they were still their own independent thing that didn't really fit into either of the other bipolar power blocks. That's not the direction Warcradle's gone, however. This is what the power structure looks like in Dystopian Wars 3.0. So if you look there along the left side of the screen, you'll see the 3.0 factions, and you see that there are now 8 major factions: the Union of Federated States, the Latin Alliance, the Commonwealth, the British Crown, the Empire, the Covenant of the Enlightened, the Imperium, and the Sultanate. And all of the various Dystopian Wars factions now kind of fit in under one of these 8 major factions. If you look in the new Dystopian Wars background material, each one of these 8 different factions are roughly co-equal in terms of their overall war-making potential. So in terms of industrialization, in terms of population, in terms of technology level, they all sort of balance out. Now, they may not have exactly the same balance of those various characteristics, but on the whole, they are roughly equally matched. And so, the Dystopian Wars 3.0 world is no longer this bipolar Cold War turning to a hot war standoff between these 2 huge power blocks with all these other minor nations and the Covenant trying to fend off some sort of global catastrophe. Instead, you now have 8 different major power blocks, each vying for some kind of piece of the pie when it comes to the world's resources and control over territory. So, looking at the Dystopian Wars factions, you can see how these old factions sort of map onto the new ones. And remember, right, there is no Federated States of America, for example, right at the top. There is no more Federated States of America in Dystopian Wars 3.0. The Federated States of America is no longer a thing. Instead, it's now the Union of Federated States. And so the Union of Federated States, and remember the Star Wars Disney model, is taking some of the elements that we saw in older versions of Dystopian Wars for the Federated States of America and merging them into some other different elements and making an entirely new thing. But if you played the Federated States of America in the older versions of Dystopian Wars, the new faction that's most closely aligned to the faction you're used to is going to be the Union of Federated States. And so on and so forth down the various power blocks here. As you can see, for example, both the Blazing Sun and the Chinese Federation are now part of the Empire, a sort of bloc faction that is more or less like the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, if we want to dip into that little bit of World War II history. So, faction takeaways. No faction from the old game has been squatted, all right? So if you have used a faction in the past and you have the models and you really like elements of the background material, what have you, all of that can be carried forward in some way. It'll have to be modified a little bit depending, but it can be carried forward in some way with the new system. There's been a lot of realignment, so that means that the neutral and mercenary factions have gone away. So that will limit some of your flexibility. So if you're used to playing a mercenary faction with your Federated States of America that's not the Honorable Eclipse Company, say like the Black Wolf, you'll no longer be able to do that under the new power structure unless you're willing to just sort of make up a little bit of your own fluff. You could argue that, oh, hey, this group of the Black Wolf is some sort of separatist rebels or something from the main Black Wolf mercenary company, and they've decided to toss in their lot with the Union of Federated States. That type of thing is always possible. After all, once you buy the game, it's yours, and you can do with it what you want, right? The rules police aren't going to come knocking at your door. But in general, in terms of the official background material and fluff, there's been a ton of realignment for the factions. There's not really any more true neutral or mercenary factions in the game, at least as it's structured now. All right, so that's kind of the first big question. On to the next big question. Are my old models still usable? Short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes, but. All right, so here's the deal. What is not happening is a restatting of the old models, okay? So for those of you that remember the Dystopian Wars 2.0 to 2.5 transition, what Spartan basically did for both of those versions is they took the entire ORBATs, Orders of Battles, the list of the model stats, and they went through and they overhauled the entire thing. They changed point values, they changed weapons loadouts, they changed ship types. They did a whole bunch of different things to kind of rebalance the game between those editions. That's not happening here. War Cradle is developing their own stats for their own set of models, and what you will be able to do is you'll be able to use your old models as proxies for these new stat lines. So that means that your old models are still usable, all right? But there is a little bit of a challenge, right? If you go back to this right here, you'll see that, for example, with the Commonwealth, they're going to release the Commonwealth stats. But what that means is that you'll be able to take your Russian cruisers or your Black Wolf cruisers and represent them on the table as a Commonwealth force using the Commonwealth stats as the rules for the models on the table. Let's take the Imperium down here as an example. This was my favorite faction, Prussian Empire, back during the Spartan days. Very much looking forward to the new Imperium models. This is a stat card for the Imperium Cruiser. Now, I should say before I go too much farther, these are the beta stats. This is the most recent version of the beta stats I could find. They're largely going to be representative of what's coming here in the next few days from War Cradle itself. So this is just to be representative. But do bear in mind that the exact stats you're seeing here on this card are not the final no-kidding stats. Anyway. If we look down there where the arrow is pointing, you've got the weapon stats. So you've got a heavy gun battery that fires from the forward 270 of the ship, front, port, and starboard. You've got a second gun battery, basically a second turret, that shoots aft, port, and starboard. So that basically means that you would normally have a ship that looks something like this. And what you've got is you've got a turret on the front. You've got a turret at the rear. Both of those can fire in a 270-degree arc, both directly off the front and to either side of the ship. And then you've got these broadside guns here in the middle. Now, this is the old model for the Prussian cruisers from the very, very first edition of Dystopian Wars. Many of you out there may very well have access to some of these models. What you will notice is you've got a turret up in front, but in the back there, there's no turret. So this now creates a problem, right? You're not WYSIWYG anymore. What you see is what you get, but not in this case. Now, I should emphasize, this is not strictly speaking a problem, right? You can fix this with upgrades, and I'll get into that in a little more detail, but I should also emphasize that if you wanted to play that stat line without upgrades, just as it is with the model, you can do that under the new rules. The reason being that in Dystopian Wars 3.0, you measure all of your ranges and you measure all of your firing arcs from the center of the model, not from the weapons mountings. That was the case under the older versions of the game. So in that situation, you really don't care exactly what turrets are on the model and where. You really only care about knowing where the center of the model is at, and then measuring your distances and your arcs from that point. Therefore, not being WYSIWYG, strictly speaking, is not a deal breaker. But here's the thing. Speaking for myself, if I don't have the ability to see what's on my models, I tend to get confused pretty easily about what model has what loadout and so on and so forth. And if we're being honest, there's a good chance that your opponent might as well. So, my general policy when I play a miniature game is to try and be as WYSIWYG as possible. That is to say that all of the weapons and whatever else that the model is equipped with are physically represented on the model. It just helps to make things a lot clearer on the table and sort of gives the game a little more of a cinematic feel, I think. Your mileage may vary, but that is my opinion. So, as I said, the solution's upgrades. In this case here, at least under the beta, you could replace one of those turrets with a shield generator for a nominal additional points cost. In this case, 15 more points. Gives your ship a little bit better defense by taking away some of the action dice against enemies that are attacking you. So what that means, going back to our picture of the old Mark I cruiser here, is that this right here, where there's no turret, that's no problem. You can just say that that's roughly where your shield generator is instead of a turret. And you can just say that you replace that app turret with a shield generator, and all of a sudden, you're right back in compliance with WYSIWYG. And everybody's happy. Some caveats, of course. Now, as I mentioned, we don't have the finalized unit stats yet, so there may be some changes coming to how you handle upgrades that might impact how some of the models from the old game can be imported into the new game. We don't know exactly what upgrades are going to be available, what their point costs will be, and what they're going to be replacing on the models that you take those upgrades on. And there is a decent chance that not all of the old models in your collection will have a close enough stat line in the new Orbats to really satisfy that WYSIWYG itch, to really make that as nice as we would like it. That being said, I have heard from a very reliable source that the Orbats will have a proxy list on them that will list which old models can be substituted for the new models that are being described on the new Orbat stat lines. So at least we'll have that to help us sort of navigate our way through the new Orbats and figure out which models from our collections will be usable with the new edition here. And as most people know by now, there will not be land units in the Orbat releases. The game is focused on sea battles with air support. This is something that Warcradle decided very early on. There's been some discussion about down the road for a little ways doing a revised land game with a bit larger scale. But for now, that is still sort of well into the future, and the focus is going to be naval battles with some air support. And that air support does include both the small carrier planes, the SRSs, and the larger airship models. So those will be making a comeback. Both the shooty airships and the flying aircraft carrier assault aircraft. So we have that to look forward to. I'm personally happy that my Imperium Sky Fortress for my Prussian collection is not going to be a paperweight in the new edition. Looking forward to getting that to the table once again. So, to sum up, yes, your old faction will still exist in the new edition of the game. And yes, your old naval and air models will still be playable in Dystopian Wars 3.0. Alright, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this video. I'm still sort of not super experienced at making YouTube videos, so if you have any comments or constructive criticism, I'd be glad to hear that. Please suggest that in the comments below, or on Facebook, or over on the MBS forums. Anywhere you care to drop in and leave a note, I would greatly appreciate it. Likewise, I am looking to make more videos here for Dystopian Wars 3.0 as the releases continue to roll out. So, if you have any topics you would like me to address in a video, also interested in hearing about that as well. Until next time, this is Ruckdog saying good luck and good hunting.